Hello and welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to manipulate keyframes using animation. So I'm just going to paste a comment here that shows a keyframe illustration, that is a keyframe from 0% to 100%. Basically, this is the timeline of the animation. So when we say start the transformation from 0%, looking at the illustration, the rotation starts at 0%. From the first timeline, it is at 0%. It doesn't move. And that's what you see right here. But the moment we start moving, at 50% of the overall timeline, that is somewhere here, the rotation should have moved from 0 to 20 degrees. And from that 50%, the timeline will begin to move to 100% timeline, and that will rotate back to 0 degrees. So from this point, which is at 50 here, it then begins to rotate back to 0 degree at this point. And that's what you see happens when you put your mouse on it. At 50%, it rotates. Let me change the timeline to say 4 seconds. So 50% of 4 seconds will be 2 seconds. For 2 seconds, it's going to rotate to 20 degrees. Then for another 2 seconds, it's going to return back to 0 degree. You can see that move. So it's important to understand this timeline here for you to understand how to manipulate the timelines here. Let's take some few examples. If I want to move this from just the start, instead of it going from 0 to 50, then to 100, I want it to move only to 100. I'm going to take out this and say, just move from 0 to 100. That is, when it gets to 100, that's when it should be 20 degrees. If we put our mouse on it now, you see it goes to 100 and then it swaps back. It swaps back means that it resets the playhead. The playhead plays here and gets to 20 degrees, and then it resets the playhead. That's why you see there is a jagged movement at the end, resetting the playhead. If you don't want the playhead to be reset, if you want the playhead to stay at the end, you put forwards here so that the playhead stays at the end of the timeline. Let's check it out now. And then this is what happens. The playhead stays at the end of the timeline. If I say 50 here, that is, it should start here, and then at 50% of the timeline, that is, when it gets to somewhere here, it should get to 20 degrees, because when it gets here, what happens at the rest of the timeline? It resets it back to 0 degree. This is the same thing as doing this. So if I take this out now, at 50%, it gets to 20 degrees, and then it resets back to 0 degree. Let's do a little bit more. I'm going to add another percentage and say at 70%, it should do 10 degrees more. So basically what happens is that at 50%, it does 20 degrees, and then at 70%, that is somewhere here, just a very short timeline between here and here, it should go back to 10 degrees, and then let's say at 85%, it should go back to 15 degrees, and then of course it returns back to the last 0 degree at the end. So let's see what happens here. If you mouse over it, you see it creates this effect. Let me make the duration high. So it goes right at, can you see that? And that is going from 50% is at 20 degrees, then it returns back to 10 degrees at 70%, and then at about 85%, it goes to 15 degrees, and then of course returns to 0 degree, which is the last part. Understanding this will help you create complex animation. Let us do one more. Let's say we have it starting at 0% and 100%. That is, it should start from the timeline at 0, and then it should end at 0. And then I'm going to change how it transits in the transformation. So I'm going to say at 80%, the timeline should get to 80 before it translates to 20 degrees. And then the rest will now go back to 100. What you see that will happen is that it will go slow before it gets to 20 degrees, and then it will quickly return to 0 degree. Let's check that out. It goes slow, and then it returns back speedily. We can do it the reverse by saying create the first animation 20 degree, that is at 20%, get to 20 degree, and then go slow until you go back to 0. You would see that it quickly goes and returns back, quickly goes and returns, quick and returns back. If you really know what you're doing, you can add more parameters to create more dynamic animations. For instance, I can say start 0 at 0%, at 50%, and also at 100%, and be in 20° at 20% and also 80%. So this is what happens with this configuration. At 0, it is at 0°. At 20% timeline, it is at 20°, and then it goes back to 50. It is back at 0°, and then it goes to 80. It is back at 20% and 20°, and then back to 0° in 100. I'm going to put a comma here to separate these timelines, and I'm going to make this forward so that it does it just one time. Okay, so when you over it, you see that movement.